Tonight's story isn't about shootouts or gold rushes. It's about the quieter corners of the Wild West. The places behind saloons and inside saddlebags were where people tried to escape the weight of dust and memory and silence. We're going to explore what getting high meant out there. Not in neon-lit rooms with vinyl records spinning, but in candlelight, in heat, in the folds of tents and the backs of wagons. We'll meander through the substances people turned to, the strange medicines they swallowed, the quiet ways they sought relief, or simply a break from everything they carried. Not to judge, not to glorify, just to wonder, gently. Because getting high in the Wild West wasn't about parties. It was about pain, about boredom, about dreams that wouldn't come on their own. So fluff your pillow, let the air settle, and let your mind wander to a time when nothing was clean, everything hurt, and even escape was handmade. And in the comments, if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what helps you drift away these days. This little sleepy corner is better with you here. Now, pull the blanket up, let the wind fade behind the walls, and drift with me softly into the haze of another time. Let's begin opium and other soft escapes. It wasn't called getting high. Not then. There were no labels, no warnings, no moralizing signs posted on doors, no talk of addiction, dependence, rehabilitation. You didn't use. You took. You swallowed. You smoked. You sipped. You did what you had to, when the pain was too loud or the world too dry. And often, what you reached for was opium. Not because it was trendy, but because it worked. Because it dulled the edge. Because it made the room warmer, the day shorter, the sorrow lighter. Opium came in many forms. The most common was laudanum, a bitter red tincture that stained everything it touched. It was sold by doctors and merchants and traveling salesmen who called it a cure for colic, for cough, for sleeplessness, for sadness. It came in tiny glass bottles with labels that promised relief. And for a while, it delivered. It slowed the heart. It softened the ache. It made thoughts float instead of sink. And out in the West, where everything hurt and nothing stopped hurting, that was worth more than gold. Mothers gave it to their children. Men took it before bed, or in the morning, or at lunch. Soldiers carried it in their kits, used it before they cleaned wounds or after they failed to. It dulled the stomach and clouded the eyes. You stopped caring, which sometimes meant you stopped living, but slowly, quietly, wrapped in cotton and sleep. That was the appeal. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't rare. It was as ordinary as vinegar and as trusted as soap. You bought it when you could afford it. You traded for it when you couldn't. It sat on shelves beside tins of lard and boxes of dried beans. And when it ran out, some shook the empty bottle for the last drop, holding it on their tongue like communion. Others smoked opium. Not everyone. Mostly immigrants. Mostly Chinese laborers working the railroads and mines who brought the ritual with them from across the sea. They built dens, narrow and low-ceilinged, where pipes rested on ceramic pillows and smoke curled like silk. To outsiders, it seemed strange, dangerous. But inside, it was calm. Soft voices, low laughter. A place where time slowed enough to become bearable. Whiskey was cheaper, more common. It burned on the way down, cleared the throat, numbed the belly. Sipped from a tin cup or swallowed from the bottle, it was everywhere. You didn't need an excuse. You needed a reason not to. And most people didn't have one. It was called snakebite medicine, panther sweat, liquid courage. It filled the gap between loneliness and sleep. It filled the silences when words dried up and ghosts came knocking. But alcohol made people loud. Opium made them quiet. One led to broken chairs and split lips. The other led to long stares and slow breathing. Some mixed the two, not out of recklessness, but out of routine. A sip of whiskey, a pinch of powder, a moment of peace. You didn't think of consequences. You thought of now. Now my leg doesn't hurt. Now my wife isn't coughing in the next room. Now the baby is asleep. Now the silence is manageable. Other substances found their way west, too. Cocaine, in its early form, was used in toothache drops and tonics. Morphine came in with the Civil War veterans and stayed in their pockets until the vials ran dry. Cannabis grew wild in some places, was smoked in others, baked into recipes when someone felt experimental. None of it was exotic. None of it was special. It was just part of life. Just another thing in the trunk, beside the rifle, and the Bible, and the tin of lye. The line between medicine and escape was always blurred. You didn't get high to rebel. You got high to stay on the horse, to stay awake long enough to finish your shift, to stay alive long enough to bury someone, or marry someone, or cross that final stretch of canyon between nowhere and not yet. Some grew dependent, some didn't. Some fell into it like sleep. Others crawled out of it slowly, sweating and shaking, when the supply ran out or the guilt caught up. But mostly, it just was. It was how people managed, how they coped, how they found softness in a world that offered very little of it. And when it worked, when it really worked, it was quiet. A slow fade, a dream that didn't bite, a moment where everything stopped hurting or started making sense, or at the very least, started feeling far enough away to bear. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd overdose, but because you'd misunderstand. You'd think it was about pleasure, about euphoria, but it wasn't. It was about silence, relief, a way to keep moving in a world where everything hurt, and most people stopped asking why. Let the old bottles gather dust. Let the pipe go cold. Let the silence return without fear. You don't need the bitter taste, not tonight. You don't need the thick haze to blur the edges. Tonight, peace comes without a bottle, and dreams come gently, all on their own. The Wild West had a medicine cabinet, and it was full of strange things. When we think of medicine, we think of neat white pills in orange bottles, lined up behind a counter under fluorescent lights. But the medicine cabinet of the Wild West was something else entirely. It wasn't a cabinet. It was a crate, a sack, a cluttered corner of a wooden shelf where bottles clinked together and powders shifted in their tins like dry sand. You didn't have labels you could trust. You had hand-scribbled names: snake oil, miracle salve, Indian root, blood bitters, lung balm. And no one was really sure what was inside. They called it medicine, but that didn't mean it healed. It just meant someone said it might, that it could, that it had, once, for someone, somewhere. The man who sold it usually wore a suit, even if the rest of him looked like he'd slept in the dust. He'd roll into town in a wagon, painted with bright lettering, Dr. Finch's famous elixir, or Professor Mallory's universal tonic. He'd stand on a crate, shout into the street, and draw a crowd with promises you didn't dare believe, but couldn't quite ignore. Because everyone out here was in pain. Everyone had something wrong. A cough, a rash, a limp that never went away. Nights of no sleep, mornings of no strength, and no real doctors to turn to. So when a bottle was waved in front of you, glinting in the sun, you paid the coin, or bartered a chicken, or promised to pay next week. What was in it? Alcohol, usually. A strong hit of it, mixed with herbs, with turpentine, with sugar, with things best left unlisted. Some had morphine, some had cocaine, some had crushed beetle shells, or mercury, or dried roots pulled from the edge of a canyon. You tipped it back and hoped for the best. Sometimes it helped, Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it made you feel like flying. Other times, it made your stomach boil. You didn't take one dose and stop. You kept the bottle nearby. You sipped from it at night when the baby wouldn't sleep. You reached for it after a fall. You offered it to guests when the coffee ran out. Just a taste, you'd say. Just enough to settle the nerves. It lived on the shelf beside the matches and the Bible. And you didn't always need a traveling salesman. Town general stores carried tonics in rows, bitters for digestion, cough syrup made from opium and molasses, nerve tonics spiked with strychnine in small, safe amounts. And no one blinked. It wasn't scandalous. It was normal. A bottle for what ailed you, whatever that was. And if you didn't have a bottle, you went to the earth. Plants became doctors. You boiled willow bark for pain. You mashed plantain leaves for bites and stings, sage for cleansing, horehound for colds, slippery elm for your throat. Some of it worked. Some of it didn't. Most of it was learned from people who didn't write books. Just passed knowledge down with whispered warnings. Only use the root. Never give this to a child. Boil it long enough or it'll kill you. You had to be careful. Foxglove could strengthen the heart or stop it. Jimson weed made visions, but it also made madness. Nightshade grew in the shadows and whispered promises you couldn't survive. Still, people tried them. When the pain got loud enough, you listened to anything that sounded like hope. And there were other ways. Pouches of herbs tied to your wrist, ashes rubbed into the skin, steam baths in tents built from hides and rocks. You prayed, you chanted, you drank things that made your tongue swell. You did whatever you had to do to keep your body from falling apart, or to at least forget that it already was. Medicine wasn't science. It was faith. Faith in a label, in a neighbor's advice, in the smooth-talking stranger who swore he cured 3 men of blindness and made a woman walk again in Kansas City just last month. You didn't believe him. Not really, but you paid him anyway. Because something about the way he handed you the bottle, like it weighed nothing, made you feel like it might work. And sometimes it did. Maybe not because of what was inside, but because the body is strange, and belief is powerful, and desperation can turn anything into a miracle if you squint hard enough. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd get sick, but because you'd have no idea what to take when you did. You'd open the bottle, sniff it, and hesitate. You'd look for dosage instructions. You'd expect safety. But safety didn't live here. Only trial and error. Only instinct and inheritance. Only trust, shaken loose by too many miles and too little help. But they did it. Day after day. Tonic after tonic. Because there wasn't anything else. Let the bottle stay corked. Let the roots stay buried. You don't need remedies tonight. You don't need to read the label twice. All you need is stillness. And a quiet moment without pain. And that is enough for now. High in the saddle, chewing, smoking, and sniffing to get through the day. It didn't matter if you were a cowhand, a scout, a farmer, or someone drifting from one dusty town to the next. The days in the Wild West were long, and they were often hard in ways that didn't always show on the surface. But under the leather, the sunburn, the cracked lips and calloused palms, everyone was looking for a little edge. Something to keep them awake. Something to ease the boredom. Something to bite the pain. Something to remind them they were still alive. And for many, that came in the form of a chew, a puff, or a sniff. Tobacco was the most common comfort, or vice, depending on who you asked. It was cheap, widely grown, and came in a dozen forms. You could chew it, smoke it, roll it, or twist it into rope-like plugs and shave it down with your pocket knife. Men kept pouches of it close, pressed flat against their chest or hip. They dipped fingers into it like it was food. And in some ways, it was. A hunger for calm, for distraction, for something bitter and familiar in a world that gave very little of either. Chewing tobacco wasn't elegant. It wasn't subtle. You wedged a wad into your cheek, let the juices mix with dust and saliva, and spit where you stood, brown ribbons painting the ground beside your boot. Saloons reeked of it. So did the floors of bunkhouses and the backs of wagons. It kept your jaw moving when there was nothing to say. It helped with nerves before a poker hand, before a gunfight, before a long, silent ride across the plains. For others, smoking was the ritual of choice. Cigars were status symbols. Pipes were tradition. Cigarettes were quick. You rolled them by hand, not because it was fancy, but because you couldn't buy them pre-made. Tobacco, paper, spit, patience, that was all. You struck a match on your boot heel or against the rough edge of the hitching post and leaned back as the smoke curled around your eyes. It wasn't about getting high. Not really. It was about making the moment longer, slower, breathing something out when the day had taken everything else in. Snuff was another companion. Powdered tobacco, sniffed straight up the nose from a tin or a pinch between fingers. It hit sharp, sudden, and hard, a jolt behind the eyes that cleared your sinuses and made the world feel just a little brighter for a little while. It wasn't for everyone, but for some, it was the closest thing they had to energy, or clarity, or control. And these weren't habits picked up casually. They were inherited, observed, passed between men, the way you'd pass a flask or a story. You watched your father take a chew when he rose before dawn. You saw the old trail boss light his pipe with shaking hands after a cattle stampede. You learned that nicotine didn't make the world better. It just made it quieter. And sometimes, that was all you needed. But it wasn't just tobacco that helped you through. There were plants and powders, leaves and barks, things you smoked that grew wild if you knew where to look. Some folks dried sage and mixed it with tobacco. Others crumbled herbs with strange names they couldn't pronounce but knew from travelers and tribes. Some of it made you laugh. Some made you cough. Some made you feel like your body wasn't yours for an hour or two. That could be terrifying. Or welcome. And then there was coffee. Not high in the way we mean it today, but strong enough to make your teeth chatter. You boiled it black, bitter, and burnt, grounds floating on top. No cream, no sugar, just heat and sting and sharpness to keep your eyes open through the next storm, the next shift, the next round of fixing what had just broken again. Cowboys drank it by the tin cup. Ranch hands drank it at midnight and again at dawn. It was less a drink than a shield. It braced you. It reminded you that you could keep going. Every substance had its place. Not for celebration, but for endurance. They weren't about escape, not fully. They were about coping, sustaining, surviving. You got high in the West, not to float away, but to stay standing. And sometimes, the things you reached for weren't in bottles or rolled in paper. They were habits, repetitions, a song hummed under your breath, a toothpick chewed to splinters, a piece of jerky always in your pocket, a way to trick your mind into focusing on anything but the blister, the heat, the loss, the fear. Because high wasn't just about substance. It was about distance. From pain, from grief, from the knowledge that tomorrow might come with another letter unopened, another horse gone lame, another cough that didn't sound quite right. You wouldn't last a day, not because the drugs were too strong, but because the reasons people took them would be too raw. You'd wonder why someone chewed all day with a jaw already sore, why someone lit their pipe again even after it burned their lips, why someone smiled through the smoke like it was the first good thing they'd tasted in months. But they knew. They knew that out here, relief was a rare thing. You took it however you could, even if it stained your teeth, even if it hurt your lungs, even if it made you slow, or strange, or still. Let the air clear. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breath move freely, with no smoke in your chest and no ache on your tongue. There's no need to chew, no need to light, no need to reach. Tonight, you are free of the weight, and that is the highest feeling of all. High on the range, buzz, bite, and the secrets in a saddlebag. There's a different kind of high when you're out on the range. Not the kind that lifts you in laughter or sends your thoughts spinning like wagon wheels on loose gravel, but the kind that hums behind your ribs. The kind you ride with, mile after mile, when your senses are just sharp enough to notice every sound, every shadow, every slight change in the wind. Out here, getting high wasn't about escaping reality. It was about surviving it, riding it like a half-broke horse, knowing it could buck you any second. Want to know what the cowboys were really chewing while they watched the herd under the blazing sun? Want to know what bottles they tucked deep in their saddlebag, wrapped in socks so they wouldn't clink too loud when they rode into town? Want to know what powder a man might blow into his palm before a duel? Not for luck, but to feel nothing at all? It wasn't all grit and iron. It was desperation, ritual, and habit. And a lot of it started small. Before the fire went out, someone would take a sip of something sharp. Not just to warm up, but to come down from the nerves still shaking under the skin. Whiskey, mostly, or gin, cut with herbs that made the air seem softer. The bottles had no labels, just dark glass and a memory of someone who said it helped. And it wasn't just the men. Women had their own methods, quiet, domestic, disguised as medicine. Laudanum was often tucked into the same drawer as linens and sewing needles. A few drops on the tongue, enough to smooth the edges of grief, or exhaustion, or the ache of another pregnancy. For nerves, they said, for the headache, and it was true. The line between sickness and sadness was thin, and no one asked too many questions. Especially not the midwife who handed over the bottle. Especially not the husband who saw her eyes drift half shut while the soup boiled too long. Getting high wasn't about indulgence. It was survival in disguise. In mining camps, men passed around little paper wraps of cocaine. It kept them awake, kept their hands moving when the air below ground was too tight, too hot, too full of ghosts. It was called snow, even in places where snow never fell. They licked their fingers, tapped their boots, stared too long at nothing. And when the work was done, they crashed, hard. Sleep came like drowning, too deep, too fast, and never long enough. On the edge of the desert, traveling medicine men sold hashish extracts to curious pioneers and wounded soldiers. A tincture for dreams, they whispered. It came in little wooden vials, painted with flowers. You dropped it into tea, or straight onto your tongue. It was sweet at first, then strange. Then everything moved a little slower, and the heat didn't seem to matter as much. You didn't fly, you drifted. Others smoked herbs they didn't name, rolled in thick paper, or packed into little carved bowls, not always for the high, sometimes for the ritual, for the rhythm. Inhale, exhale, let go of the day, let go of the death, let go of the way your hands wouldn't stop shaking. Still others found their high in danger, the trigger pull, the quick draw, the sudden snap of action that lit the brain with something no drug could mimic. They chased adrenaline like it was breath. They rode into town too fast, took bets too big, stared down men they should have walked away from. And afterward, when it was quiet again, they reached for the bottle, or the pipe, or the little paper square tucked behind their belt. Because no high lasted forever. And the fall was always waiting. People didn't talk about these things, not directly. You'd hear someone say they were out of sorts, that they needed a bit of tonic, that the air was too tight lately. Everyone understood. Everyone nodded. No one asked what was really in the jar. You wouldn't last a day, not because the substances were too much, but because the silence around them was, because you'd expect labels, warnings, lines not to cross. But out here, those lines didn't exist. Only thresholds. Only choices made in the dim light of a lantern with a world that asked too much and gave too little. They weren't addicts, at least not in the way we say it now. They were survivors, chasing a feeling just strong enough to get them through another hour, another dawn, another name etched into a wooden cross outside of town. Let the haze settle. Let the taste fade. Let the body unwind without help. No bottle. No pipe. No powder. Just rest. Soft, natural, and clean. And if you dream tonight, let it be without price. Let it come easy. Let it be enough. Addicted to silence, the quietest high of all. There was another kind of high in the Wild West, not poured from a bottle, or rolled between paper, or measured in drops, but found in the deepest quiet. A silence so vast it made your thoughts echo. A silence that came not from peace, but from absence. From being so far from everything and everyone that the only thing left to feel was yourself. And for some, that was a kind of high, too. You rode for miles without speaking. Just the sound of the horse breathing, the creak of saddle leather, the wind sighing through dry grass. And at some point, you stopped thinking. You stopped remembering. Your mind slipped into the rhythm of hooves and horizon, and the ache of the world lifted. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to feel light for a little while. That was the strange truth of it. People out here didn't always need a substance to escape. Sometimes, all they needed was distance, or silence, or time. That quiet could become its own drug, addictive, consuming, seductive, in the way it smoothed every rough edge without lifting a single finger. You could lose yourself in it. A man on the edge of a canyon, staring at the endless sweep of sky and red stone, could forget everything. His debts, his guilt, his grief, just by staying still long enough. A woman hanging laundry alone on a plane could feel the silence settle around her like a blanket, warm and heavy. Children, too, sometimes wandered out into the field. They always had to make into the field, not to play, but to listen. To nothing. To the emptiness that hummed like a lullaby. Some folks feared it. The silence. Said it made them feel like they were dissolving. Like the land was erasing them, one breath at a time. But others craved it, built their lives around it. They chose cabins far from town, dug wells deep into lonely hillsides, rode into the distance and didn't come back. Not because they didn't want people, but because they wanted something else more. A stillness that nothing else could give them. They became addicted to the quiet the way others became addicted to laudanum or whiskey. You could see it in their eyes when they came to town. Always watching, always tense. Too many voices. Too many footsteps. The piano in the saloon was too loud. The laughter too sharp. They stayed only as long as they needed. To get supplies, to trade goods, to hear if any mail had come. And then they vanished again, back into the wide silence where their thoughts felt clearer and their breath came easier. And there were those who found their high in routine, in the repetition of chores. scrubbing the same pot, mending the same fence, feeding the same hens day after day. There was no thrill in it, but there was comfort, predictability, a kind of trance. The body moved, the mind floated. You didn't need to feel much. Just keep going, just keep doing. And in that, there was escape. In that, there was relief. You could smoke a pipe, or you could sweep a porch. And in the end, both might take you to the same place, somewhere quieter than pain, somewhere warmer than fear. And when the high wore off, whether it came from silence or smoke or solitude, there was always the same moment, the return, the sound of a crow, the creak of a door, the cry of a baby, or the groan of a saddle girth. And just like that, the spell was broken. The stillness was gone. And you were back in the world again. Some chased the high again right away. Others didn't. They let it come when it came. Like dusk, like the smell of rain before it falls. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you'd need noise, but because you'd expect it. You'd think silence meant something was wrong. You'd fill it with talk, with music, with movement. But here, silence wasn't a void. It was a balm. It was the one thing the world didn't tax, or ration, or take away when times got hard. It was always there, waiting. And for some, that was enough. Let the noise fall away. Let the quiet rise around you like dust in late sunlight. No thoughts, no footsteps, no words left to say, only stillness and breath, and the softest kind of high, the one that doesn't leave a mark. When the healer got high. Doctors, doses, and dangerous belief. In the Wild West, even the people who were supposed to help you, the healers, the midwives, the surgeons with leather aprons and shaking hands, even they weren't untouched by the haze. Because getting high wasn't just for the wounded. It wasn't just for the restless cowboy or the grieving widow. It reached everyone, including the ones holding the remedies. You see, medicine back then was closer to guesswork than science. A man with a black bag and a firm voice could call himself a doctor, and people would believe him. And if he had bottles, powders, and confidence, they'd let him treat their children. They'd let him stitch their wounds. They'd drink what he gave them without asking what was inside, because there were no regulations, no boards, no certifications to check, just trust and desperation. And many of those doctors got high right alongside their patients. Some didn't know. Not at first. They started with morphine, used it on the battlefield to dull agony when bullets couldn't be pulled and gangrene had already set in. They watched it work, watched men fall asleep instead of scream, watched boys die with peace in their faces. And they thought, this is a miracle. So they kept using it for toothaches, for fevers, for sorrow. And after a while, for themselves. You'd find them dosing laudanum between house calls, lighting their pipe before an amputation, shaking out white powder onto a tin spoon by lantern light, eyes dark with exhaustion, hands too tired to tremble, because they'd seen too much, done too much, failed too many times, and sometimes the only way to keep going was to disappear a little. And the thing is, people respected them more when they were high, because they looked calm, sure of themselves, not because the drug gave them magic knowledge, but because it dulled their doubt, their fear. They could cut deeper, suture faster. They could lean into their work without flinching, and that confidence, however false, saved lives. But it cost them too. Some doctors forgot what they'd given you, how much, when. They scribbled notes they couldn't read later. They dropped their tools. They passed out on porches. And sometimes they died, alone, quietly. in the very rooms where they'd once saved someone else. Midwives, too, used what they had, not always opiates, but herbs that numbed and soothed and blurred. They'd chew wild lettuce or sip from a flask of homemade tonic between births. Not to party, not to escape, but to steady their hands, to hush the images that came back every time a labor turned wrong, every time they had to tell a mother to push harder even as the silence grew too heavy. They knew what loss looked like. They knew what failure smelled like, and still they came. Still they worked. Still they reached for whatever helped them get through one more night. You might imagine that all this made the West reckless, but it didn't. Not exactly. It made it fragile. Everyone was walking a tightrope, balancing between pain and relief, between duty and collapse. Even the ones who were supposed to fix things, especially them. And when people saw their doctor take a swig of something dark before setting a bone, they didn't panic. They nodded. They understood. Because out here, the healer wasn't a saint. He was another soul, just trying to get through the day. And yes, there were fakes. Charlatans. Men who sold tonics they didn't believe in, who got rich while others got sick. But most weren't like that. Most believed what they were doing helped. And maybe it did, because belief is powerful. And when you don't have clean water, or clean tools, or any real chance at survival, belief is sometimes the only medicine that works. You wouldn't last a day. Not because the doctors were too dangerous, but because they were too human. You'd expect white coats and clean rooms. But here, your doctor rode a horse and cleaned his scalpel with whiskey. Here, your healer sometimes needed healing more than you did, and still, they showed up. Still, they stitched wounds and delivered babies and cut bullets from broken bodies, and they let the doctor rest too. Let the bag stay closed. Let the tinctures sit undisturbed in their bottles. You don't need them tonight. Not the morphine, not the tonic, not the steely-eyed promise of a stranger with a badge pinned to his chest. Tonight, you are whole. Tonight, you are not the patient. Tonight, you are safe. Getting high on hope. The delusions that kept people going. There was another high in the Wild West. Quieter than opium, slower than whiskey, subtler than anything that came in a bottle or a pipe. It was the high of belief, of blind, trembling, exhausted hope. It didn't cloud your mind. It lit it, just enough to keep you standing, even when you had no reason to. And sometimes that was more dangerous than any drug you could buy. Hope came in many forms, and not all of them were kind. It whispered in the ears of gold miners, convincing them to swing their pick one more day, dig one more foot, even as their hands bled and their stomachs growled. Tomorrow, it said, tomorrow you'll strike it rich. And some did, but most didn't. Most found only dust and rock and aching backs. But they kept digging, high on a dream they couldn't let go. It came to farmers too, those who staked claims in soil that never gave back, who planted seeds into cracked earth and prayed to skies that hadn't rained in months. They read signs in cloud formations. They watched the wind. They waited. Next season, they said, next spring will be different. And when it wasn't, they still stayed, because the idea of leaving felt worse than the drought. Hope came to the lonely, to the widowed woman who still set 2 places at the table, to the father who walked to the edge of town every Sunday, looking for a son who'd left 3 winters ago, to the girl who sat by the window, long after sunset, imagining a letter would arrive, from somewhere, from someone, from anywhere but here. And sometimes it did, but mostly it didn't. And still, they waited. Because hope wasn't about the outcome. It was about the waiting itself. You see, people didn't get high because they were weak. They got high because the world kept hitting them, day after day. And sometimes you had to believe in something just to keep getting back up. And when there was no medicine, no miracle, no answer, you created one. That was the real high, the illusion, the story you told yourself. Some believed the land would save them. Others believed God would. Others believed in love, in letters that hadn't come, in lovers who hadn't returned, in promises made beneath starlight that had long since faded. They weren't stupid. They just needed to believe in something, because without it, they wouldn't last the winter, or the week, or the walk back home. Hope could be cruel, yes. It kept people working land that wouldn't grow. It made them trust strangers who didn't deserve it. It pushed them into towns that didn't want them. But it also built things. It kept fires lit. It kept songs alive. It turned silence into lullabies and dust into stories. And sometimes, it worked. A letter did come. A storm did bring rain. A hole in the ground did glitter just for a moment. You couldn't bottle that kind of high. You couldn't buy it. But you could feel it. You could hear it in the way someone said, maybe. The way someone held on just a little longer. The way someone smiled at the edge of a funeral and said, she's in a better place. Children caught it easiest. Their eyes were too big. Their world too unwritten. They believed in heaven, in angels, in the idea that their parents would never die, that the horse would come back, that the storm wouldn't break the roof this time. And the adults, weary, scarred, bent at the spine, they borrowed that belief just long enough to tuck the child in and say, sleep now, everything's all right. But it wasn't always, not really, and still, they said it. Because saying it made it feel true, just for a little while. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd run out of supplies, but because you'd run out of faith. You'd want proof. You'd want logic. You'd want reason. But out here, there wasn't any. Just that small flicker inside, the one that said, maybe tomorrow will be better. And in a world that gave so little, that flicker was gold. Let go of the outcome. Let go of what hasn't arrived. Let go of the wait. Tonight, you don't need a reason. You don't need a promise. You don't need to believe in anything at all. Just rest. And if hope wants to visit, let it come gently, soft as a breeze, quiet as a prayer, and gone before morning, the high that never ended. Fever dreams and the strange mercy of illness. Sometimes, getting high wasn't a choice. It wasn't swallowed or smoked or poured into a glass. It came uninvited, through the doorway of sickness, through a cough that never stopped, or a scratch that festered, or a chill that sank so deep it never left. The Wild West was full of diseases, ones we now know by name, with treatments and vaccines and cures. But back then, they arrived like ghosts, quiet, cruel, and always with something to take. When fever came, it came hot. It came with eyes too wide, breath too fast, sweat that soaked the sheets and chilled the skin. And the mind lifted out of the body like steam. You said things you didn't mean. You saw things that weren't there. You heard voices. You reached for people long gone. You spoke to the ceiling as if it were the sky. And sometimes, that fever state, that burning, half-conscious drift between pain and peace, was the highest high of all. They called it the fever talking. They tucked blankets under your chin, wrung out cloths, dabbed your forehead, and hoped you'd come back. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. But in that in-between place, your body soft and weightless, and your thoughts unbound, there was a strange mercy. The pain faded for a while. The worry slipped away. The world tilted and swayed and folded itself into something dreamlike. something where the rules didn't matter anymore. Malaria, typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia, names that meant little at the time, but everything in practice. They hollowed people out, slowly, beautifully sometimes. There was a mythic glow to those last days. The pink flush in the cheeks, the glitter in the eyes. It wasn't health returning. It was the final flicker before the candle went out. And in that flicker, people often smiled, laughed, spoke with eerie calm. Children with high fevers talked to angels. Old men with lung rot gave long wandering speeches about rivers they hadn't seen in 40 years. Women near death asked to be dressed in their finest gown and requested songs from their childhood, songs no one remembered until they started to sing. And the strange thing was, no one was frightened by it, because they'd seen it before. That kind of high, that slow detachment from the body, that moment when the pain stops being pain and starts being something else, floating, rocking, distant. The fever didn't always kill, but when it did, it was sometimes kinder than the life it was leaving behind. And for some, though they wouldn't say it, there was a part of them that welcomed it, not death, but that soft dissociation, that moment where your body isn't yours and your thoughts can go anywhere and no one expects anything from you but breath. It was the only rest some ever had. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd catch something, but because you wouldn't know what to do when the line between reality and dream started to blur. You'd panic, try to ground yourself, try to fix it. But out here, they didn't fight the fever. They rode it. They let it carry them where it wanted, because sometimes the fever knew where to go better than they did. And when it broke, if it broke, they came back changed, thinner, slower, quieter, but somehow softer too. Like part of them had been scraped clean, like the illness had burned away the sharpest edges and left something tender behind. You are not fevered. You are not floating. But you are warm. You are held. And the dreams that come tonight will be gentle. Let them drift in. Let them take their time. Let them carry you softly, the way only dreams or fevers ever could. Saloon smoke and midnight remedies, where the highs met the hurts. The saloon was many things. A place to drink, to gamble, to dance, to hide. But above all, it was a sanctuary for the broken. Not the polished kind of sanctuary with stained glass and silence, but the smoky, sticky kind where everyone had a secret and everyone was searching for something to take the edge off. You didn't go there for joy. You went there because you were tired, because your hands wouldn't stop shaking, because your wife had died, because your land was dry, because you couldn't sleep, because you were already halfway gone and needed something, anything, to help you forget. And the saloon keeper? He wasn't just a bartender. He was the pharmacist of the desperate. He knew who needed the cheap whiskey and who needed the bottle from under the counter. He knew which poker player mixed laudanum with beer. He knew which woman behind the bar slipped hashish drops into her tea just to stay upright after midnight. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give sermons. He just poured. The air inside was thick, not just with tobacco smoke, but with stories. The kind that didn't get told, only hinted at, in the way a man stared into his cup, in the way a woman laughed too loud, in the way a drifter sat with his back always to the wall. And in that haze, the highs and the hurts mingled so closely, they became the same thing. Opium had its place even here. Not openly, not always, but in back rooms, behind velvet curtains, and under lanterns turned low, you'd find the pipe. You'd find the silence. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for company. Just a place to sit while the world disappears. Some folks drifted back there and didn't return for hours. Some didn't return at all. And then there were the midnight remedies, strange brews mixed from ingredients no one could quite name: boiled bark and rye, sugar and spirits, oil of turpentine with a splash of lemon. "It'll set you right," someone would say. "Just a drop." And you'd believe them, because they believed it, or needed to, because your bones ached, and your stomach was sour, and your mind wouldn't sit still. You drank. You waited. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it made things worse, but always it made things different. And out here, different was often enough. The saloon girl who smiled at everyone might have a little tin of snuff in her corset, not for pleasure, but to keep from falling asleep on her feet. The gambler with the silver watch might be chasing a cocaine high just to feel sharp enough to bluff his way through another round. The preacher who came in just to talk might leave with reddened eyes and a flask in his pocket. Because in the West, morality bent in the wind. There were no clean lines, only needs. Only nights that went too long and mornings that came too fast. People shared what they had, not out of generosity, but out of mutual recognition. "Here," they'd say, offering a swallow, a puff, a pinch. "It helps." And that was the only language that mattered. Help. Not healing, just help. You wouldn't last a day, not because the saloon was dangerous, but because it was honest. It didn't pretend. It didn't judge. It simply existed. A place where people crawled in from the dust looking for something to numb the silence in their heads, and found it, if only for a little while. Sometimes, someone would play the piano, softly. A slow tune that no one danced to, a song no one knew the name of. And in that moment, with the drink half full and the room dim and the smoke curling above your head like a ghost that meant no harm, that was the high, right there, that sliver of peace, that fragile moment when the world paused and you didn't feel like breaking anymore. Let the smoke clear. Let the music fade. Let the bottle stay corked and the remedy stay on the shelf. You don't need it tonight. Not here. Not now. You're not in the saloon anymore. You're safe. You're still. And for this quiet moment, you don't need anything but breath, drifting without drugs, the strange high of the long ride. You didn't always need a bottle to escape. Sometimes the land did it for you. Sometimes the saddle and the sun and the endless rhythm of hooves beneath you were enough to push your mind into a place where time thinned out and everything started to shimmer. The long ride could break you, or it could lift you. And if it lifted you just right, it felt like a high you didn't have to pay for. No pills, no powder, just dust, breath, and the way the horizon always stayed, just out of reach. There's something about riding for days, about the way the saddle creaks and your legs go numb, about the way your thoughts loop and repeat until they start to unravel like twine. You begin by thinking about practical things, weather, directions, supplies. Then you drift to memories, regrets, faces you haven't seen in years, and then it gets quieter. The thoughts spread out, they stretch, they lose their shape, and you just ride. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just forward. The high of the long ride wasn't sharp or sudden. It came slow, like heat soaking into your bones. It was a trance, a rhythm, a softness that only arrived when your body was too tired to argue anymore. Some men chased it on purpose. "I ride better alone," they'd say, but what they meant was, "I think better when I stop thinking." And the only way to stop thinking was to ride until you disappeared a little. You didn't eat much on these rides. Jerky, hardtack, a few swallows of water gone warm in the canteen. The hunger became part of the buzz. You got lightheaded. your senses twisted. The shape of the hills began to look like old stories, the clouds like faces, the wind like a whisper. If someone saw you on the trail and waved, you might wave back, or you might not be sure if they were real. Either way, it didn't matter. Time folded in strange ways. You'd think it was noon, but the sun would be setting. You'd think you'd ridden 10 miles, but the town still hadn't appeared. You'd think the rider behind you was a stranger, only to realize it was your own shadow, moving beside you in the twilight. This was the clean high, the sober high, and yet it changed you all the same. It made your speech slower, your eyes softer, your grip on reality flexible. And when you finally stopped, when the horse drank from the creek and you knelt to make a fire, everything felt unfamiliar, even your own hands, as if you'd come back from somewhere, but couldn't remember the language anymore. Sometimes, when men returned from long rides, they didn't speak for a while, not because something had gone wrong, but because silence still clung to them like dust. They'd sit by the fire, blinking slow, holding their coffee cup like it was heavier than it used to be. Their families would ask, "How was the trip?" And they'd just nod. That was all. Because the ride wasn't something you described. It was something you left pieces of yourself in, and there were those who never came back. Not lost, not dead, just farther out, choosing the endless ride over the hard return, living off saddlebag rations and starlight, sleeping wherever their horse stopped walking, breathing deeper than most knew how to, high on nothing but motion. You wouldn't last a day, not because the ride was hard, but because it was too quiet, too long, too lonely. You'd need music, or maps, or someone to talk to. But out here, there was no soundtrack. Just hooves, just breath, just the sound of your own thoughts loosening their grip. And for some, that was the best kind of high. Not escape through chemicals, but through space, through silence, through moving so far, so fast, so long, that your mind simply ran out of things to say. Let the trail fade. Let the horse stop walking. Let the wind settle. You don't have to go anywhere tonight. You don't have to be anyone, but still. You've ridden far enough for one day. And now, you can rest, smoke signals, and sacred highs when the spirit world came closer. Not every high in the Wild West came from desperation. Not every escape was about avoiding pain. Some were sacred. Some were ceremonial. Some were older than the West itself, passed down long before settlers drew maps, or built towns, or named mountains that already had names. For the native peoples of the land, getting high wasn't escape. It was connection. A bridge between the physical and the spiritual. A path to visions, to ancestors, to meaning deeper than what the eyes could see. These rituals didn't happen in saloons or bunkhouses. They happened in circles, around fires, beneath stars, with smoke rising like a thread between earth and sky. The herbs used weren't for pleasure. They weren't recreational. They were chosen, respected, grown with intention, harvested with care. Tobacco, yes, but also sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and sometimes plants that whispered only to those who knew how to listen. Peyote, for example, a small cactus, bitter to taste, sacred in ceremony. It didn't offer a casual high. It brought visions, clarity, heat. It showed you what you needed to see, not what you wanted. The world shimmered. The ancestors spoke. Time bent inward. And the one who took it didn't laugh or dance. They sat. They wept. They understood something new, even if they couldn't explain it when the sun returned. The smoke wasn't always inhaled. Sometimes it was washed over the body in a rite of cleansing, smudging, a way to brush off the weight of grief, fear, illness, a way to prepare the spirit for what came next. And the person leading the ritual, the healer, the elder, the one who held the stories, didn't deal in cures. They dealt in balance. They asked questions the settler doctors never thought to. What dream did you have before the sickness? Who have you not forgiven? When did you last speak to the sky? To those from the outside, it looked like superstition, or magic, or madness. But to those who lived it, it was medicine of the truest kind. Not for the body, for the spirit, for the part of the self that went dull when life got too hard. And make no mistake, the West was hard for Native people in ways others couldn't imagine. Their lands taken, their languages outlawed, their ceremonies driven underground. And yet, the rituals survived. The smoke still rose. The songs were still sung in whispers, even when no one was supposed to hear. Sometimes, settlers and cowboys caught wind of these traditions. They didn't understand them, but they saw something in the calm, the focus, the glow behind the eyes of those who had just returned from ceremony. Some mocked it, some feared it, and a few, a quiet few, asked to join, to sit near the edge of the circle, not to steal, but to understand. And in rare cases, they were allowed to witness, to see what it meant to use plants not to flee, but to return, to come home to the self. It wasn't a high you chased. It was a high that came only when you were ready, when your heart was quiet enough to listen, when your grief was ripe, when the question inside you had gone unanswered for too long. It wasn't euphoric, it was clarifying, and it could undo you, not with chaos, but with truth. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd take too much, but because you'd expect the wrong thing. You'd look for fireworks, for spinning colors, but what you'd get is stillness. A hand on your chest, a voice in your head that sounded too much like your own. You'd hear the wind, not as noise, but as language. You'd feel seen, and for some, that's more frightening than any vision. But the ones who walked out of those ceremonies, they walked slower, softer, like they knew something you didn't, not in pride, but in peace. Let the smoke drift past. Let the circle stay unbroken. You don't need visions tonight. You don't need to speak to the ancestors. Just breathe. Just rest. And if the spirit world wants to whisper, let it. You are safe here. You are quiet now. And the stars are watching, gently, the sweetness of the wrong thing. Candy, syrup, and the comfort high. Not every high in the Wild West came from something dangerous. Some came from things that seemed innocent, things you'd find in a child's pocket, in a kitchen tin, on the general store shelf, behind the biscuits and the bolts of cloth. Sugar, syrup, the candy and wax paper, twisted tight at the ends. Because when the world was dry, cracked, and cold, the smallest sweetness could feel like magic. And for many it was. A brief, glimmering high that didn't blur the senses, just softened them, like butter on warm bread. The body craved it, not just for energy, for comfort, for warmth, for the feeling of something good on the tongue when nothing else in the world was good. A peppermint lozenge tucked under the lip, a spoon of molasses stirred into morning coffee, a hard candy cracked between the molars and left to melt slowly like a tiny secret. Children chased it with wild eyes and sticky fingers, but adults needed it just as much, even more maybe. Because when you'd been riding all day in sun that peeled the skin off your nose, or when you'd gone to bed too many nights on boiled beans and bread gone stale, that sugar hit your bloodstream like a miracle. Not enough to erase the pain, but enough to tilt the world ever so slightly toward bearable. It was the poor man's medicine, the rancher's luxury, the housewife's paws in a day of endless tending, a lump of brown sugar from the tin when no one was looking, a smuggled cookie from the preacher's wife's tin, a ginger chew wrapped in waxed paper that had traveled 3 states in a trader's pocket before ending up on your tongue. And then there were the syrups. Cough syrup was thick and sweet, often mixed with opiates, alcohol, or chloroform. Not a joke. Not a danger label in sight. Just a little brown bottle with a handwritten tag and a spoon resting nearby. People used it for more than coughs. For sleep, for calm, for quiet. You'd tip the spoon into your mouth, feel the burn, then the smooth, then the drop in your shoulders as it slid down your throat and settled behind your ribs. People knew. Of course they did. That the syrup made things fuzzy, that the sweetness covered something stronger. But they didn't care. Because what else could give you sleep like that? What else could hush a baby at midnight? What else could take the rattle out of your chest or the worry out of your thoughts? Even simple syrup, sugar melted in water, became a balm. Mixed with tea, with herbs, with whiskey, poured over cornbread, soaked into cake, stirred into fever water, and offered with a kiss on the forehead. It didn't cure anything, but it reminded you that kindness still existed, that not everything had to hurt. And sweets weren't just sugar. Some chewed licorice root straight from the earth. Bitter, yes, but with a long, lingering sweetness that clung to the teeth and tongue. Others boiled wild honey and pine sap into taffy, pulling it with greased hands beside the stove, telling stories while it cooled. That was the high, the ritual, the making, the moment of joy before the chewing began. You wouldn't last a day, not because of what was missing, but because of what you didn't expect to matter. You'd overlook the little tin of peppermints. You'd say no to the sugar cube. You'd think candy was for children. But out here, a single sweet could turn the day around, could remind you that you were still alive, and could give you just enough pleasure to keep from falling apart. And sometimes, it went too far. Sugar could become a shield, a crutch, a reason not to feel the sharper things. You'd find someone huddled by the stove, licking syrup from a spoon like it was all they had left. And maybe it was. But it was never mocked. Not really. Because everyone had their version, their thing, their tiny daily fix that no one talked about. A moment of sweetness in a bitter world. Let the syrup stay capped. Let the candy remain untouched. Let your mouth rest and your mind settle. You don't need sugar to soften the edges tonight. The world is already quieter, already gentler, already just sweet enough. The high that followed violence, numbness, adrenaline, and the aftermath. There was a high in the Wild West that no one talked about, because no one wanted to admit it existed. It came not from herbs or drink or powders, but from the moments after something violent happened. After the shot was fired, after the punch was thrown, after the blood hit the dust. It was a terrible kind of high, one born of survival, of chaos, of the body and mind trying to process the unprocessable all at once. You didn't plan for it. It took you, rushed in like thunder. Your heart beat like a drum. Your vision narrowed. Your breath came fast and shallow. In those first seconds after a gunfight or a brawl, when your ears were still ringing and your hands still shook, you felt everything and nothing, all at once. You felt the heat of the adrenaline, the weight of the moment pressing into your ribs. And for just a flicker of time, you felt invincible, or invisible, or like you didn't quite exist at all. Some men came to crave it, not the violence exactly, but the after, the silence after the noise, the way the world seemed sharper, clearer, cleaner, like every leaf on every tree had been polished, like the sun was brighter, like the wind whispered just to them. They didn't need opium or whiskey to reach that place. They needed danger. They needed the edge. That's why so many picked fights in saloons over nothing, why cards turned to fists, why glances turned to duels. It wasn't about honor. It was about chasing that jolt, that rush, that wild, electric hum that followed the moment when life and death sat side by side at the same table. You'd see it in the eyes of men after a shootout. They'd laugh too loud, or not at all. They'd walk in circles, unable to sit, or they'd slump in a chair like they'd been hollowed out. Some cried, not from guilt, from release. The body had gone through too much, too fast. And there was no drug on earth that could equal that particular cocktail of fear, fury, and fragile relief. And the problem was, that high didn't fade quietly. It crashed, hard. Hours later, your hands still trembled. You smelled the blood on your clothes. You saw the twitch of a dying man's boot behind your eyes every time you blinked. You remembered the sound of his breath, ragged and fast and final. And then the questions came. Was it worth it? Was it necessary? Could I have walked away? So you took something, anything, to bring yourself back down. Whiskey usually, fast and hot. A shot to burn away the memory. A shot to keep your knees from giving out. If you were lucky, you found a bed. If not, you slumped over your horse, or lay down behind the stable, or drifted into half sleep with your gun still in your hand. The body wasn't meant to hold so much fear, so much fire. It had to release it somehow. So it turned it into a high. Not pleasure, but a buzzing numbness. A shield. A moment where nothing hurt because everything hurt too much. Some didn't come down from it. They walked around jittery, eyes scanning every crowd, fingers twitching near their belt, ready again, needing it again. Not because they wanted death, but because they didn't know how to live without that rush anymore. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't fight, but because you couldn't understand how someone could want the fight, could crave that moment just before the trigger pulled, could find meaning in the noise. But out here, when the world didn't offer softness or safety, that feeling was the closest some ever got to being awake. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't condemned. It just was. Like wind, like fire, like the sound of boots walking away from something they can't take back. Let the breath slow. Let the edge dull. Let the tension melt from your jaw. There's no fight tonight. No shots. No blood. Only calm. Only you. Here. Safe. In the quiet after everything. The high of disappearing. When walking away was the only cure. Sometimes the strongest drug in the Wild West wasn't in a bottle, or rolled into a cigarette, or whispered across the poker table in the saloon. Sometimes the purest, cleanest high came from something quieter, more dangerous, more permanent. The high of leaving, of vanishing, of walking away from everything and everyone and never looking back. Men did it all the time, some at dusk, some at dawn, some while their families slept, their saddlebags already packed, others in broad daylight, with nothing but silence and the sound of spurs clinking softly down the road. They left behind farms, women, children, dogs that waited at the door. They left because the weight got too heavy, or the ghosts got too loud, or they simply didn't know who they were anymore and didn't want to find out. It wasn't always dramatic. Often it was gentle, a note maybe, or nothing at all, just absence, like a chair pushed in too neatly, a cup unwashed, a hat still hanging on the peg. And the ones left behind would say, "He's gone." And sometimes That was all they could say. Because out here, people disappeared. That was part of life. And the strange truth? Sometimes it felt good to leave, to be no one, to ride into a town where no one knew your name, to sleep under stars that didn't remember your sins. That first night on the trail, with your back against a rock and the fire flickering low, it felt clean, like a kind of baptism, like whatever had been following you had stopped just short of the ridge. That was the high. To start over. To shed the past like a skin. To not be the man who lost the crops, who couldn't save his brother, who drank too much, who buried too many. To be someone new, or to be no one at all. You could see it in the faces of the drifters, that glaze in the eye. Not from whiskey, not from opium, but from distance. From the long quiet between where they'd been and where they were going. They didn't speak much, didn't ask questions. They weren't running anymore. They were just gone, a little. Women disappeared too, less often, but just as completely. A girl who left her apron hanging by the hearth and walked toward the horizon with a bag slung over her shoulder. Maybe to join a caravan. Maybe to find a brother. Maybe just to stand still in a place where no one knew she once sang lullabies to a child who never woke up. And then there were the ones who disappeared inside themselves. They didn't leave towns. They left conversations. They left laughter. They left their own names behind like boots they no longer needed. They worked their hands to the bone and never looked up. They listened but didn't speak. They sat in rocking chairs long past midnight, staring into spaces where nothing moved. They weren't high in the usual sense, but they'd slipped somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere the pain couldn't follow. Not because it wasn't real, but because they'd turned away from it hard enough, long enough, that it couldn't find its way back in. And sometimes, only sometimes, they returned. Different, slower, kinder, maybe, or colder, but still alive. They walked back into their lives like men returning from war, though no one had seen them leave. And when they spoke again, their voice was a little lower, a little farther away. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you couldn't walk away, but because you'd expect to feel guilt. And here, sometimes, there was none. Sometimes, the freedom was too sweet, the air too light, the road too open to regret anything at all. Because the West didn't demand you stay. It didn't need you to explain. It let you go. And for some, that was the first kind of peace they'd ever known. Sleep now. Let the trail fade. Let the voices calling your name grow quieter. You're not leaving. Not tonight. You're safe where you are. You are here, and you are enough. But if you ever need to disappear, even just in your mind, you know the way now. And the stars will always follow, getting high on the horizon, chasing what you'd never catch. There was a high that didn't come from any substance, any smoke, any bitter tincture. It came from a line in the distance, from the endless call of the horizon. That thin curve between the sky and land, always just a little too far away. You could chase it for a lifetime. Many did, and that chase itself became the high. The need to move, to seek, to follow something you couldn't name. It started innocently enough. A man left home looking for work. A woman followed a letter, a rumor, a promise. A boy packed a small bag and said, just to the next town, but kept going. And with each mile, the craving grew. Not for a destination, but for motion, for change, for the next bend in the trail. Because if you stopped, everything caught up. The memories, the grief, the questions. But if you kept going, maybe you'd outrun it all. The West offered that illusion that there was always something better just past the next ridge. A mine that hadn't been tapped. A town that wasn't cursed. A love that would actually stay. And even when you found nothing, the promise kept you walking. That promise, that maybe, was the hit. It lit up the blood, made your chest swell, made the sky feel like it was leaning in close. That's why so many wandered. Why so many maps had names that didn't match the stories. Why so many graves were marked unknown. Because they'd started chasing the horizon and couldn't stop. Because turning around felt more unbearable than starving. Because starting over felt more real than staying still. It wasn't just geography. Some chased ideals. Justice, freedom, reinvention. They came west to escape their own names, their old crimes, their past loves. They dyed their hair, changed their accents, told lies so often they started to feel like truth. And in that way, they got high on becoming, on transformation, on the thrill of shedding old skin, even if they didn't know what they looked like underneath. And there was danger in it, because the horizon never ends. And chasing it meant you were never satisfied, never home, never still. You'd meet someone in a saloon who laughed too loud and looked at the door between every drink. A man who'd been to 5 territories in as many years. He'd tell you he was just passing through, but the way he said it felt like a confession, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Because the truth was, he didn't know how to stop. And in rare moments, they'd pause. Maybe in the arms of someone kind. Maybe on a porch swing at dusk, hearing crickets and smelling bread. They'd feel the temptation to stay, to settle. But the pull was too strong. The sky called them. The ache returned, and they saddled up again before dawn, whispering a soft goodbye to a bed that had just begun to feel like peace. Even the land seemed to conspire with this hunger. It stretched endlessly, with no answers, no walls, just space. The way the sun moved across it made you feel like you could start over every single day. That yesterday's regrets would disappear behind the hills. That somewhere ahead, something would finally make sense. You wouldn't last a day, not because the chase was too hard, but because it never ended. You'd expect to arrive. You'd expect the horizon to give you something back. But it never does. It just moves. Like a mirage, like memory. Like a story you're too far into to quit, but too tired to keep telling. And still, they chased it. Because sometimes, chasing the horizon was the only thing that felt real. Let the distance rest. Let the boots come off. Let the trail vanish behind the fold of your mind. You don't have to move tonight. You don't have to seek or run or become. You've gone far enough. And for once, the horizon can wait. Dust-laced dreams, the slow float between sleep and the substance. In the Wild West, the line between waking and sleeping wasn't always clear, not because people were lazy, but because the world wore them thin. Slowly, constantly, until there was nothing left but exhaustion and ache and the deep pull of rest. And yet, sleep didn't come easy. Not the good kind, not the soft kind. It had to be coaxed, or stolen, or sometimes manufactured. Because when your body still buzzed from the day and your mind refused to settle, you needed something more than darkness. You needed to be taken there, gently, or not so gently. They called it drifting, that feeling just before sleep, when the world slips sideways and your thoughts unspool. And for those who'd seen too much, done too much, or lost more than they could name, that drift was sacred. It was the only time nothing hurt. the only time they didn't have to pretend to be strong. But for many, it didn't happen on its own. It came with a little help, a sip, a smoke, a scratch of something into the palm. The most common was drink. Not to get drunk, not to celebrate, just to slow down. Whiskey was the lullaby of the West. A shot before bed, maybe two, just enough to dull the edges, to turn thoughts to fog, to soften the stiffness in the joints. Men would sit outside their cabins, stare into the embers, and sip until the night finally felt far enough away. Then they'd crawl into their blankets, fully clothed, and wait for sleep to come creeping in, like smoke under the door. But drink wasn't always enough. Not for the ones who heard too many things in the silence. Not for the ones who saw faces in their dreams. So they turned to powders, tinctures, tonics sold under a dozen names. Sleepy syrup, nighttime elixir, restful mind formula. What they really were, opiates mostly, mixed with sugar or wine or vinegar. One capful knocked you sideways, two sent you swimming, and once you found the right dose, the right rhythm, you came to depend on it. Not for pleasure, but for stillness. And when the bottle ran low, the panic came. Because no one wanted to return to the kind of sleep where dreams came sharp and hot and filled with fire. So they rationed, measured carefully, cut with other things, drank slower, hoped the next peddler would roll into town with another crate of miracle sleep in his cart. Children were given it too. Not often, but enough. A teething child, a feverish baby, a little spoon of syrup to ease them down, to hush their cries, to make the night manageable. The parents didn't feel guilty. They felt grateful, because sleep wasn't just for the child. It was for everyone. A quiet house was a gift you sometimes had to mix yourself. And then there were the drifters who learned to sleep in shifts. An hour here, 20 minutes there. Eyes half open, ears twitching at every rustle of wind. They couldn't let go completely, not without help. So they chewed on dried leaves, smoked herbs rolled tight with spit and thread, or dosed themselves with a bitter root soaked in whiskey. Not to escape, just to let go. Women, too, found their own ways. A hot cup of tea with valerian root made behind closed doors after the children were tucked in. A folded handkerchief soaked in tonic, held beneath the nose until the eyes fluttered shut. A soft hymn sung under breath, over and over, like a chant, like a prayer, like a spell woven into the pillow slip. And sometimes you didn't need anything at all. Just enough dust in the air, just enough heat, just enough quiet. You'd lie on your back in the barn or on a blanket beneath stars too bright to be real. You'd let your limbs go heavy. You'd feel the breeze moving like a slow animal across your skin. And for a few sacred seconds, you'd feel like you were floating. Not high, not low, just somewhere between. Between memory and dream. Between ache and nothing. That's where most people wanted to stay. But it didn't last. The night ended. The dawn came. The rooster crowed. And whatever you'd taken, be it syrup, smoke, silence, or song, wore off. You woke up stiff, or spinning, or with a film over your thoughts. You sat at the table with your coffee and stared at the knot in the wood grain, trying to remember what it felt like. That moment just before sleep. That moment where everything was okay. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you couldn't sleep, but because you'd expect it to heal you, to restore you. But out here, sleep didn't do that. It patched you just enough to stand. It gave you just enough dream to keep from drowning. And that had to be enough. Some nights, the only dream you had was of a place with no chores, No pain, no fire to stoke, no past to remember. Just soft ground, cool sheets, a pillow that didn't scratch, a voice humming something low and kind. Let the bottle stay closed. Let the spoon stay clean. Let the herbs stay folded in their cloth. You don't need anything tonight. No syrup, no smoke, just the weight of your body, just the hum of your breath. Let the dreams come slowly. Let them wrap you gently. Let them lift you, not high, not far, just enough to feel weightless, just enough to feel like you're floating, just enough to rest. The buzz of loneliness, when solitude was too loud to bear. In the Wild West, you didn't need a drug to feel off your axis. Sometimes, all it took was silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the hush of a gentle night with a crackling fire and the soft sigh of a horse outside the door. No. This was the kind of silence that echoed, that stretched, that made your breath sound too loud and your heartbeat feel like an unwelcome guest. This was the silence of true loneliness, a high in its own right, a high you didn't ask for, one that crept in through the cracks when no one was watching, one that lingered even when the sun came up. Loneliness in the West wasn't rare. It was built into the landscape. You could ride for days without seeing another soul. You could sit on your porch and hear nothing but wind for a week straight. Your nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away, and the road between you wasn't just dirt, it was time. You couldn't walk it at night. You couldn't always ride it during rain. So you stayed still. And the silence filled the room like smoke. People found ways to cope. They talked to their animals, wrote letters that might never be sent, sang to themselves, told stories aloud, even with no one listening. Some carved faces into fence posts just to see something look back at them in the morning. Others drew lines in the dust and played pretend checkers, just to feel something. And sometimes, the loneliness hit so hard it felt like a tremor in the chest, like a buzzing behind the eyes. Your hands couldn't sit still. Your mouth moved without words. You stared at the same crack in the wall for an hour, trying to remember what it felt like to have a conversation. A real one. Not just bartering for flour or nodding at a stranger passing on horseback. It didn't matter who you were. A cowboy on the trail. A widow on the homestead. A child left with nothing but chores and silence. Loneliness came for everyone. It didn't care about age or strength or pride. And when it settled in, it changed you. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. It made your voice softer, your eyes duller. Your laugh, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. And the strangest part? Some people got addicted to it. Not because they liked it, but because they got used to it. The solitude became a cushion, a wall. A place where no one could ask questions, or tell them they'd failed, or remind them of what they'd lost. Loneliness, for some, was safer than company. It didn't judge. It didn't leave. It didn't die in the middle of the night from a fever you couldn't cure. But it still hurt, deeply. And some found ways to numb that hurt. They turned to whiskey not to celebrate, but to speak, to say something, even if only to themselves. They opened another bottle of laudanum, not to dull the body, but to loosen the grip of a silence that had started to feel like a second skin. They played the same song on a cracked fiddle until the notes blurred, not because they liked it, but because it filled the room. The high of loneliness wasn't pleasurable. It wasn't flashy. It was a dull, slow burn. A background hum that turned into a roar when the night got too long. It made people write letters they'd never send. Sleep with one eye open. Say hello into the dark, even when they knew no one would answer. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be afraid, but because you'd underestimate the silence. You'd think, I can handle being alone. But out here, alone meant truly alone. No phones, no background noise, no passing footsteps. Just wind, wood, and your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. And when the sun went down, and the lantern burned low, and the coyotes started howling far off in the dark, that silence would swell until it pushed against your ribs. And you'd start to understand why someone might drink, or smoke, or ride until the horse gave out. Not to chase pleasure, but just to hear something else besides their own breathing. But here's the thing. Loneliness could break you. Or it could teach you. Some people emerged from it with a kind of stillness you couldn't fake. A calm. A deep understanding of themselves that city folk never knew. They could sit for hours watching dust swirl in a sunbeam and never feel bored. Because they had made peace with the quiet. Not escaped it, befriended it. Let the hush settle around you, not as a weight, but as a blanket. Let the loneliness outside the door stay there. Let the wind pass without knocking. You're not alone here. Not tonight. This silence isn't empty. It's full of you. And that's enough. Chasing lightning. The high that came from storms. There was a certain kind of high in the Wild West that didn't come from a bottle or a pipe, or even loneliness. It came from the sky, from storms, from the vast, roaring rush of wind and thunder that rolled across the plains like it had something personal to say. Because out here, the sky wasn't just background. It was everything. It was life and death and beauty and fear, all folded into clouds that could turn black in a heartbeat. Some folks ran from storms, but others waited for them. Some even chased them, not with horses or wagons, not with ropes or maps, but with eyes wide open, breath held, hearts thudding like hooves. Because there was something electric in the air when a storm came, something you couldn't explain. You could feel it, in your teeth, in your skin, in your bones, like the sky was charging you with something that didn't belong to this world. The wind would change first. A stillness, then a gust, a silence, then a sound. Not quite thunder yet, but a warning. The birds would go quiet. The animals would shift uneasily. And then the smell would come. Rain, ozone, something older, something sharp, something that made your blood hum. That was when the high started. If you were in town, you might shut the windows, secure the shutters, hold a lantern up to the dark. If you were out on the range, you pulled your coat tight and looked up. Some muttered prayers, others just grinned. Because the storm meant danger, yes, but it also meant awe. It meant remembering how small you were. And for some, that feeling was more intoxicating than any drug you could find behind the saloon counter. You'd hear it first, a crack in the distance, like the world tearing in half. Then the flash, then the boom. And suddenly, everything was moving. The trees swayed like dancers. The dust lifted like ghosts. The rain came sideways. You couldn't see, couldn't hear, could barely breathe. And somehow, it made you feel alive. That was the high, that rush, that spike of adrenaline when the lightning struck so close you could feel it in your teeth. When thunder hit like a drum beneath your feet. When the world blurred and all you could do was hold still and let it pass over you. Some folks rode into storms on purpose. Just to feel that. Just to ride the edge of something wild and untamed. They didn't say it out loud, but they knew. The storm did something to them. It shook loose the sorrow. It cleared out the grief. It blasted the dust off their soul, just for a while. Children huddled under tables, wide-eyed, gripping quilts. Mothers hummed lullabies to keep the fear down. Fathers stood by windows, arms folded, waiting to see if the roof would hold. And somewhere out in the hills, someone was laughing. Not out of joy, but out of recognition. Because when the storm hit, it said something you couldn't put into words. It said, "You are not in control. You are not alone. You are not nothing." And when the storm passed, as it always did, there was silence. Not empty, clean. A stillness like a held breath finally released. You stepped out onto the porch, smelled the wet wood, watched the water drip from the eaves. The world glistened. Everything looked new. That's when the second high hit. The come down, the afterglow, the strange, calm euphoria of having lived through it. The quiet smile, the ache in your chest, the way your shoulders finally dropped. It wasn't relief. It was something softer, deeper. The gift of having been shaken and still standing. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd fear the storm, but because you'd try to explain it, try to measure it, box it. But out here, you couldn't do that. Out here, the storm owned the sky. And if you were lucky, it let you stand in its shadow, just long enough to feel its power, just long enough to be. Let the clouds pass. Let the wind quiet. Let the thunder roll into the distance. There's no need to chase anything tonight. The storm has passed. You are still here, and the world, washed clean, is waiting for your next breath. The quiet high of building something with your hands. There was another kind of high out in the Wild West. Not loud, not fast, not mind-altering in the usual sense. It came from calluses, from splinters, from the deep, aching hum in your shoulders after a day spent building something that hadn't existed before you laid your hands on it. A fence, a table, a cabin, a life. You didn't get high from the wood or the tools or the nails. You got high from the doing, from the slow, deliberate act of creation, from carving order out of chaos, from watching something take shape under your own weather-beaten fingers. You'd start before dawn, sometimes. Not because it was noble, but because that's when the light came and the world started moving, whether you were ready or not. You'd carry the wood on your back, shoulders straining. You'd split it, saw it, plane it until the pile became something. A wall, a roof, a corral gate that groaned into place like it belonged there all along. You didn't talk much while you worked. There wasn't time. There wasn't breath to spare. But in your chest, a rhythm began. A slow, steady buzz that matched the swing of the hammer and the rise of the sun. That was the high. Because in a world that offered so little control, building something gave you a sense of power, even if the rains came and tore it down, even if fire took it, even if termites burrowed, or time wore the wood to dust. For a while, you made something, and that was more than most people got. You'd work until your arms ached, until your back locked up, until your fingers no longer felt like yours. You'd stop only to drink, or maybe lean on a fence post and watch the horizon for a bit, jaw clenched in that thoughtful, wordless way so common out here. Then you'd get back to it, because the doing was the relief. The ache was the escape. You didn't need opium or drink when you had a job that stole every thought from your head, except the next nail, the next notch, the next pull of the saw. Some folks built with intention, barns that would last for decades, porches wide enough to catch the breeze, cradles carved with initials that no one but the maker would understand. Others built out of necessity, a lean-to to keep the rain off, a coop to keep the foxes out. But even those acts, humble and small, gave a sense of calm, of focus, of meaning. You'd find a man sanding a chair late at night by candlelight, just for the rhythm of it. A woman patching quilts not for warmth, but for the gentle tug of thread between her fingers. A boy stacking stones for no reason other than to make a pile that didn't fall. The work wasn't about the end result. It was about the trance, the task that wrapped itself around your mind like a blanket and said, "You're okay, keep going. Just one more stroke. Just one more nail." And when it was done, when the thing was built or repaired or simply stood upright for another day, the high came gently, not with a rush, with a quiet pride, with the moment you stepped back, wiped your hands on your pants, squinted into the sun, and saw that the world looked a little different than it had this morning. Because of you. That feeling stayed with you, long after the hammer cooled, long after the blisters peeled. It followed you to sleep. That sense of purpose, of weight spent well, of doing something with your body that didn't destroy, but shaped. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't lift the wood, but because you wouldn't understand why someone would choose to, why someone would wake up sore, tired, and still eager to split another board. But out here, the work was the healing. It filled the cracks. It quieted the ghosts. It gave your hands something to hold so your mind didn't drift too far into memory. Let the hammer rest. Let the saw stay quiet. Let the floor beneath you, rough and hand-built, carry your weight without complaint. You've done enough today, more than enough. Let the world hold you, just this once, and dream of the things you'll build tomorrow. The slow burn of regret, the high that tasted like memory. There was a kind of high out here that no one admitted to chasing, but everyone knew. It came slow, quiet, crept in like smoke under the door when the fire had already burned too low to stop. It wasn't opium, it wasn't whiskey, it wasn't hash or laudanum or the thrill of a storm. It was regret. And once it settled in your bones, it clung like soot, not a rush, not a spike, just a slow burn. A warmth that didn't comfort, but didn't quite hurt either. The kind of feeling you carried like an ember in your chest, flickering every time the world went still. Out in the Wild West, regret came easy. There were so many ways to earn it. A word you didn't say, a letter you never sent, a grave you didn't visit before it was too late, a glance you misunderstood, a choice you made when the wind was high and the blood was hot and no one had time to think. And afterward, the silence came. And then the stories, and then the wondering, what if? You didn't talk about it. Not really. You just felt it. In the pause before you opened a door. In the way you stared too long at a cracked photograph. In the way you set your cup down a little harder than you meant to. Because your mind had drifted somewhere it didn't belong. That's how regret got you. It wasn't loud. It was a whisper. It made the air around you shimmer like heat on a road. It made you feel like you were floating just above your own life, remembering things not as they were, but as they could have been. And for a moment, the ache felt good. Not because you liked the pain, but because it was proof. Proof that you cared. Proof that something once mattered enough to miss. Some men rode alone for years with nothing in their saddlebags but dried meat and old regret. They weren't running from the law. They were running from the faces they saw in dreams. Some women stared into the fire night after night, knitting something for a child who would never come home, humming songs they hadn't sung since the war. And still, they found a rhythm in it. That ache, that weight. It became familiar. Like an old wound you stop noticing until the weather shifts. And when the air turned cold, when the wind came through the cracks in the cabin wall, the memories curled up beside you like a dog you hadn't fed, but couldn't bring yourself to chase away. That was the high, the soft, steady hum of remembering. of leaning into the sadness, because at least it meant you'd lived, that you'd chosen, that you'd tried, even if you'd failed. It came strongest at night, when the town went quiet, when the trail went dark, when there was no work left to distract you and no one sitting at the table across from you. You'd reach for a drink, maybe, or for a coat that still smelled like someone who hadn't been around in years, or for the edge of the quilt you stitched when you thought there'd be more time. And there it was, that gentle pull in the chest, that half smile, half sigh, that flicker of what if. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be too sad, but because you'd try too hard not to be. You'd fight the memory, drown it out, cover it with noise. But out here, there was nowhere to hide. The past came back like a dust storm, and when it did, you had two choices: run or sit down and let it pass through you. And the strange thing, when you let it pass, it softened. It didn't crush you. It held you. It rocked you back and forth like a song you only half remembered. And in that moment, you didn't feel lost. You felt human. Let the regrets drift like ash. Let them settle into the soil where they can't follow. Let the fire burn low and the night wrap around you. You've done enough remembering for one night. Let the ache rest. Let the could-have-beens go. And know this, you are still here. And that somehow is more than enough. The sweet drift of sickness, when the body let go before the mind. There was another kind of high in the Wild West, the kind no one sought, but many came to know. It arrived not in a bottle, not by choice, but in the quiet decline of the body, in the long, slow hush of illness, the kind that came without warning, stayed too long, and left you softer than it found you. Consumption, they called it, or the wasting sickness. Fevers that took weeks, agues that never left. They whispered its names around fires and on porches, as if saying them too loud might call it closer. And when it came, it didn't roar. It drifted in, patient, heavy, oddly kind, because when the body began to fade, it took your sharp edges with it. It started with tiredness, not the kind you shake off, the kind that lives in your ribs, that steals your strength one breath at a time. You'd forget why you stood, why you walked. You'd rest more, and in those moments between sleep and wake, that was where the high lived, in the fog, in the float, in the feeling that maybe, just maybe, nothing needed to be done anymore. Out there on the plains, or in a back room above the mercantile, someone would lie still for days, their cough rattling now and then, eyes half-lidded, talking slow, remembering things from childhood, asking for people who were already gone. And everyone knew they were drifting. Not gone yet, not here either, just floating between. That kind of sickness stripped you down, made your appetite vanish, your voice soften, your memory wander, and sometimes it made you peaceful. Not because you were better, but because you were tired. Too tired to fight, too tired to pretend you weren't scared. So you lay there, and the world slowed around you, and it was almost beautiful. There were remedies, sure, tonics made from wild herbs, boiled bark, hot bricks wrapped in rags and placed at your feet, and the old standbys, whiskey, morphine, laudanum. But even without them, illness had its own intoxication, a natural one, a warm buzz behind the eyes, a slow loosening of every thought that used to hurt. And people who sat with the sick, they saw it too. The way a dying man might smile at nothing. The way he'd look past the room like he was watching something no one else could see. The way his breath would grow shallow, not in fear, but in rhythm, like a tide going out, like something inside had already stepped away. It wasn't always gentle, but when it was, it stayed with you. The memory of it, the hush, the reverence. Even the sound of someone speaking in fevered fragments could sound like poetry, like prayers made from heat and memory in the body's final kindness. And then came the quiet, the long exhale, the last moment where you weren't sure if they were still dreaming or already gone. That pause, that unbearable pause, and the way the air shifted when the soul finally left the room. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't bear illness, but because you'd want to fix it, treat it, fight it. But out here, there weren't always battles to win. Sometimes the only thing to do was sit beside the bed, hold a hand, and listen to the stories they told in the space between sleep and death. Because sometimes the high wasn't in healing. It was in surrender, in the peace that came when nothing more could be done. Let the fever pass. Let the breath slow. Let the hush of that old sickness drift through, soft and distant. You're not fading. You're not floating. But tonight, you can rest like someone who has let go. No pain, no weight, just warmth. And the hush of stillness carrying you gently into dreams, high on the edge of nowhere, when the wild itself was enough. Out in the far reaches of the Wild West, where the maps thinned and the trails faded into dust, there was a place, not on paper, not in any town, where people got high on something stranger than any substance. They got high on isolation, on distance, on the sheer, crushing immensity of being so far removed from the rest of the world that you started to forget what the world even meant. You could ride for a day, 2, 5, and not see another soul. Not a building, not a fence post, just land, sky, and yourself, getting smaller with every mile. This wasn't loneliness. That came later. This was something more like awe. Something that made your chest tighten and your mouth dry. A kind of weightlessness, standing in the middle of nowhere, with the sun boiling overhead and the ground cracked like old hands. You felt high without taking anything, dizzy from how much nothing there was. And for some, that nothing became everything. You could walk out into it and feel the earth shift beneath you. The way the grass whispered without wind. The way the birds didn't call, not out here. You'd start to feel like the only living thing on the continent. And if you stayed long enough, you'd start to believe you'd always been there. Not born, not raised, not named, just there. A body in space, moving, breathing, disappearing. That was the high. Some chased it on purpose. They weren't fleeing towns or mistakes. They were seeking something purer, something wordless. They called it freedom, solitude, peace. But what they really meant was, I want to feel small again. I want to be erased, just a little, just enough to stop thinking so hard. You'd find them in the high desert, or deep in canyons that echoed like cathedrals, or beside rivers so wide and slow they looked like mirrors. They'd stare for hours, say nothing, sleep on rocks, eat only when their stomach growled loud enough to interrupt the trance. And they'd come back different. If they came back at all, it wasn't safe. Of course not. The wild didn't care about your high. It didn't care if your canteen ran dry or if the sun cooked your skin until it split. But that, too, was part of it. The feeling that the land wasn't yours, that it could take you without malice, that you were part of it, not above it. And then there were the sounds. The wind as it moved through bones of trees, the crackle of your own footsteps, the way your heartbeat sounded louder when there was no background noise to hide it. That kind of silence could unmake you, or it could baptize you. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be in danger, but because you'd need answers. You'd want signs, a direction, a purpose. But out here, there was none. There was only presence. Only the moment. Only the truth that you are a single life in a world too large to understand. And yet, that was the point. Because when you felt that, when you let it wash over you like wind over grass, you stopped needing to be more than you were. You didn't have to be good, or strong, or even brave. You just had to be. Let the horizon fade. Let the wild stretch out around you without fear. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to know what comes next. You're already there, on the edge of nowhere. And in that nothing, you are enough.